Today we're going to visit the Grand Canyon, one of the coolest places in the United States. It's in the middle uh, of Arizona. And the Grand Canyon was formed as the Colorado Plateau, which you see here, which is an area of high elevation that's flat. So it's a leveled off mountain area. And it was cut by the Colorado River, which you can see here. Now, the Grand Canyon is 277 miles long, 18 miles wide, and has the depth of about a mile. So it's a pretty enormous sight to see. This is a picture of the sedimentary rock and the Desert View Watchtower. The Desert View Watchtower is a really nice scene here, nice place to view the canyon. It was designed by architect Mary Coulter, and she used as a template the ancestral Puebloans style, the Native Americans that lived in the region. When we first pulled up here, we saw an elk, and I was pumped. Huge deer. An elk, Cervus canadensis is its scientific name. This means deer, cervus, and canadensis means from Canada. And here you see the Colorado River cutting through the plateau. And what's great about this is that we can use the layers of sedimentary rock here to study how life evolved over time and to study fossils within those layers. Up at the top in the rim area is the Kaibab limestone. And as you travel down the different layers of sedimentary rock, they get older and older and older. So this rock up here, 270 million years old. This rock down here, the Bright Angel Shale, 500 million years old. If you get to the Vishnu schist at the very bottom, at the basement of the canyon, between 1.2 and 2 billion years old. So very old rock at the very bottom of the canyon. Here's another diagram of the layers of sedimentary rock that scientists have studied. And again, 270 to 525 million years ago. Then there's something called an unconformity, where there was lots of erosion. We end up having older rock underneath it, 1.2 to 2 billion years old, depending on the location. So at the rim, the rock is about 270 million years old, and this is the late Permian period of geologic time. This is what the continents looked like at that time. We have Pangaea, the supercontinent that you studied perhaps in 6th grade. And Arizona, which normally right now isn't by an ocean at all, is covered in a low, shallow sea. What ends up happening here, forming here, is the Kaibab Formation made of limestone, and there's a whole bunch of fossils within the limestone that come from the seas. This is a diorama of the Permian Sea. I pulled this from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. That's a great place to visit. Also, by the way, you can see here, this is a nautilus, relative of the squid and the octopus. We have some sponges, we have horn corals, bryozoans, and brachiopods. These are the brachiopods right here. They look like seashells. So me and my kids and my wife, we went on a fossil hunt on the rim of the canyon, and we see a whole bunch of species that existed 270 million years ago. And this is a type of brachiopod called Miquela. Another picture of a brachiopod and an imprint. This is called a trace fossil of a brachiopod. And they look like clams or mussels, but they're actually their own phylum of invertebrate. And these guys are sometimes called the lamp shells because they look like old pottery oil lamps. Sometimes they're connected by a stalk, and that's where they get its name, which means arm foot. Brachio meaning arm, pod meaning foot. And these guys are filter feeders. So they open up their valves of their shell, which are asymmetrical. They're one's bigger than the other. They open them up and they filter feed all the plankton that's in the water. When they die, they close up, and that makes them a really effective fossil. So they were able to be fossilized pretty rapidly and preserved over time. Now, there are some that exist today, but the vast majority of these species, especially the species that we see here in the Kaibab Formation, they go extinct and shortly thereafter during the Permian extinction. We also saw evidence of horn corals. These are extinct organisms. They don't exist on Earth any longer. The way they got their food, these are animals. They look a little plant-like, but the horn corals are part of the genus Rugosa, which means wrinkled. They are upside down jellyfish, and the small part of their horn sticks into the sediment, and they collect plankton and other small microscopic organisms with specialized stinging cells called nematocysts in their tentacles. So these organisms had this hard shell, and they retracted into the shell when they needed protection. The part that gets fossilized is this bony carbonate shell. Here's another species of organism that we see in the phylum Porifera. These are the sponges. This is a fossilized sponge that's 270 million years old. Sponges are unicellular organisms that act like multicellular organisms, and they create within themselves a structure made of silica, and that's the part that gets fossilized, and it's hard and resistant to erosion. So it actually sticks out of the ground here at the rim at the top of the Grand Canyon. This is what a sponge might look like from the Permian period. Here's another picture of a sponge. Last species I wanted to show you were crinoids. These guys are called sea lilies, and they look like plants, but they're not. They're actually relatives of starfish. Some people call these a sea star on a stick. These feathery appendages here are used to collect plankton, and their mouths are in the middle. And their stalk here, down the middle of their stalk, is a primitive cord, nerve cord. And that's what ended up getting fossilized, that stalk, creating the Cheerio-type structure. If you were to cut the stalk in cross-section, they have almost like a vertebrae in a human, circular bones, type of bony structures. I shouldn't call them bones, but bony structures that were able to be fossilized over time. But we didn't get a chance to go down into the Grand Canyon. My kids are little and it's really steep. My wife was getting a little nervous there. But if you were to go down further to the Bright Angel Shale, for example, which is 500 million years old, you're going to see some trilobites like this one you see here. Up here at the top, this is 270 million years old. As you go down further, it's older and older and older. The Bright Angel Shale down here is where you might find some trilobites, 500 million years old. At the very bottom here, it's called the supergroup, the Grand Canyon supergroup. This rock here is 1.2 billion years old, and this is where we find evidence of the oldest fossils in the Grand Canyon. And these are called stromatolites, and these are limestone structures created by cyanobacteria. And these are these little green bacteria, very primitive photosynthesizing organisms. They're responsible for the oxygen creation here on Earth. At the time, these are 1.2 billion years old. So as we go down layers of sedimentary rock, we see older and older and older organisms, and many of the organisms are no longer around. Most of them are extinct.
Pretty awesome, isn't it? The Grand Canyon is one of the most spectacular natural wonders on Earth. 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its widest, and more than a mile deep into Earth's crust. And unlike the Great Wall of China, you can actually see it from space. all of the water in all of the world's rivers would only fill it halfway. It almost defies belief. The Colorado River, the river that made this canyon, is only about 100 meters wide. That's not very big as rivers go. The Mississippi, the Amazon are far, far bigger, and they've never made anything like this. So, how did it happen? No one was around to see it form, but its story is written in all of those beautiful rock layers. Geologists are kind of like time-traveling detectives. They look for fingerprints here and there, retrace the footsteps to retell Earth's story as best as we can. Now, the Native American people in this area call this canyon Kaibab, which means mountain lying down or upside down mountain. And they didn't know how right they were, because down there at the bottom of the canyon, the oldest rocks are mountains. The oldest rocks at the bottom of the canyon are named after the Hindu god Vishnu. About 1.8 billion years ago, the area that's now the Grand Canyon was covered in mountains taller than the Himalayas. But over hundreds of millions of years, erosion wore them down into hills just tens of meters tall. From this point on, the evolution of the Grand Canyon doesn't happen in a dry desert like you see today. It happens underwater. Ancient oceans filled this area from a billion years ago to as recently as 80 million years ago. That water would rise and fall again, depositing sand and mud and even ancient seashells, compressing them into rock, piling layer upon layer, and creating this colorful layer cake just waiting to be cut. But you might notice we're not at sea level right now. About 70 or 80 million years ago, this whole area took a tectonic elevator ride straight up, creating this high plateau. But there was still no river and no canyon. Northeast of here, that same uplift created the Rocky Mountains and their snow-covered peaks. Melting snow began to flow and pool up in this area. Small rivers joined together to make larger ones. Some pooled up into lakes. Some even changed direction. And about 5 or 6 million years ago, the Colorado River was born. That's not that old in geological time, but this river is special. It drops 10 feet for every mile that it travels and carries 500,000 tons of silt and sand and rocks downstream every day. It's like liquid sandpaper. It cut the plateau backwards, the same way that a waterfall wears away at a cliff, cutting this mile-deep scar like a hot knife through butter.
Excuse me. I'm wondering, where's the Grand Canyon? Do you know where? We're trying to find, the Grand Canyon.
Here's an idea.
Oh! It's easy to miss.
So that's how it got deep. But how did the canyon get so wide? Well, gravity took over. Rain and ice chipping away at the canyon walls, and as it fell, it was carried downstream. Fossils and rocks from this area have even been found downstream almost as far as the Gulf of California. And that's pretty much how we got the canyon of today. If you want to turn a mountain upside down, all you need is time. This canyon's still changing. It's getting deeper and wider, and as we continue to study it, the story of this canyon will change too. There's stories like this locked in Earth's crust all over the planet, hidden from view. But that little river has opened this one to us. Stay curious.